Jonas Fletcher stood at his cabin door watching early morning snow accumulate at the base of his walls. Wind swept through the pines at 25 miles per hour. Temperature had dropped to 20 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Inside, his stove crackled, but warmth dissipated into the vast mountain air faster than the fire could replace it. His first winter in the Wind River Valley had proven that traditional cabin building could only take him so far. Most trappers stacked logs tight with clay for insulation. This method worked well enough in milder climates. But the high country's extreme swings, where winter lows plummeted below freezing for months, demanded something else entirely. This winter, fuel would be the deciding factor. How much wood would Jonas burn? How much time could he save by burning smarter? One match, clean draft, and a well-stacked fire could save an hour a day. That hour could change everything. Jonas Fletcher's hands bled as he split logs into the late autumn evening. The valley's crisp air and long October daylight had helped him assemble the shell of his first cabin. But already it showed signs of failure. The fire that had burned through his first logs now sputtered weakly. Frost had begun forming along the rafters by nightfall. He'd arrived from Virginia in 1833, joining the fur trade with basic carpentry knowledge and high hopes. His background in woodworking was both blessing and curse. The skills served him well, but not all frontier methods aligned with Eastern techniques. Jonas had followed standard practice. Logs stacked 8 to 10 feet long, mud chinking between gaps, stone fireplace at one end, basic tools, axes, saws, the occasional hammer. He'd built exactly what other trappers built. The logs had been cut fresh in summer. He thought they'd weather the coming winter just fine. But unseasoned wood shrank. It cracked. It leaked heat faster than he could keep the fire alive. By month's end, he'd burned through 4 cords of firewood, 3 times normal consumption for one man in the same time frame. His tally stick told the story in notched lines. Each notch represented a day's fuel. The stick was filling up far too quickly. Winter was coming. The situation was already dire. Deep chill had settled into the cabin. No amount of firewood seemed to abate it. Jonas sat hunched by the stone fireplace, breath condensing in the air. Frost crept across the walls despite hours of effort keeping the stove blazing. He'd used standard one-wall fireplace design, believing it sufficient for warmth. But his logs, non-seasoned, shrank as they dried. This opened cracks in the cabin that no amount of clay or moss could fill. His structure felt as cold as the wilderness outside. The fireplace sat in a corner rather than centrally located. Half its warmth radiated uselessly to the exterior wall. The other half rose toward the ceiling, escaping through gaps near the roofline Jonas hadn't sealed properly. He'd used logs with bark still on them. He hadn't understood the moisture retention problems this would cause. Clay from nearby creek beds served as chinking. It cracked during the first hard freeze, then crumbled away. Jonas kept a ledger of his firewood consumption. By February's end, the numbers shocked him. 24 cords burned, roughly double the expected amount. The cabin was still freezing. Something had to change. Fast building had created slow dying. Niels Bergstrom arrived at Jonas's cabin in late October. The Swedish trapper had been in the mountains since the early 1820s. One of the old-timers who'd seen everything and survived it all. He wasted no time inspecting the structure. After a quick glance, he looked at Jonas with a steady gaze. "You're cold here," he said. It wasn't a question. Jonas didn't bother denying it. Niels's experienced eye immediately identified flaws Jonas had missed. Heat moved in specific ways, he explained. It radiated from hot surfaces like stone and fire. It conducted through materials, faster through some than others. And it rose, which was why the ceiling area of any cabin stayed warmer than the floor. The problem with Jonas's cabin was that every one of these heat movements worked against him. The fireplace radiated half its warmth to the exterior wall. That wall conducted the heat straight outside. Rising heat escaped through gaps near the roofline. The log walls, which seemed solid, actually acted as moderate conductors. Not terrible insulators, but not good ones either, and the cabin had no mass inside to hold warmth after the fire died down. "In the old country," Niels said, "we learned long ago how to keep warm. You build the heat storage inside the house, not outside. The fireplace must be in the center, or at least not touching the outer walls. The mass of stone must be surrounded by the warm air, so it holds that warmth and gives it back slowly through the night." He explained that the best cabins he'd seen in the Rockies were built by trappers who'd learned from their mistakes, usually after suffering through multiple winters. They positioned fireplaces in the interior when possible, or at least built them with significant mass extending into the living space. They used double-wall construction in the coldest areas. 2 layers of logs with packed earth or moss between them for insulation. They sealed every gap with proper chinking using materials that wouldn't crack or fall out. And they built with properly seasoned logs that wouldn't shrink and open new gaps. Jonas listened carefully. He'd already started planning his second cabin, to be built before the next winter arrived. Everything Niels told him contradicted the standard wisdom he'd followed before. But that standard wisdom had left him freezing and miserable. With Niels's advice, Jonas set out to rebuild. He realized survival depended not just on good craftsmanship, but on engineering the space for heat retention. Jonas spent the fall cutting more wood than he'd ever need. He left the logs to season through the winter months. This time would be different. He was incorporating Niels' suggestions and adding ideas from a Shoshone woman named Morning Crow. She'd passed through the valley with her husband, a French-Canadian trapper named Baptiste Marot. They'd stopped at Jonas's cabin to trade. Morning Crow took one look at his setup and laughed. "White men build cold houses," she said in the mixture of Shoshone, French, and English that served as common language in the mountain trade. "You make walls that breathe out warmth like old man breathes out life." She explained that her people didn't build with logs the way white trappers did. When they made structures meant to last through winter, they used what she called 2 skins, an inner wall and an outer wall with air or insulating material trapped between them. The principle was simple. Air itself was actually a reasonable insulator as long as it didn't move. Trap air between 2 barriers and it couldn't carry heat away. But if you just had a single log wall, the air on both sides of it was in direct contact with the wood. This allowed heat to transfer through constantly. Add a second barrier with trapped air between, and you dramatically reduced that heat transfer. Jonas began cutting logs carefully. He debarked them. He allowed the wood to dry properly. By December, he was ready to begin construction. The first major change was the foundation and floor. His original cabin had sat directly on the ground with a packed earth floor. The new design incorporated stone foundation piers at the corners and midpoints. This raised the entire structure about 2 feet off the ground. The crawl space served multiple purposes. It kept the bottom logs from ground moisture and rot. It provided a buffer of air between the cold earth and the living space. And it allowed Jonas to store items that needed to stay cool in summer but protected from deep freezing in winter. The floor itself was made from split logs, puncheons laid flat side up over thick support beams. This created an actual wood floor, much warmer underfoot than packed earth. It provided better insulation from the cold below. The air gap in the crawl space combined with the mass of the wood floor created a thermal buffer that would keep the living area noticeably warmer. The double wall system was labor-intensive. It required more materials and precision. For the north and west walls, the sides that faced prevailing winter winds, Jonas built a second wall 2 feet inside the main wall. This inner wall was made from smaller logs, also hewn flat. The 2-foot gap between the walls would be filled with a mixture of materials. Dried moss at the bottom, then a thick layer of dry leaves and forest stuff, then more moss, then a final layer of clay mixed with grass. The idea was to create multiple layers of trapped air and insulating material. The east and south walls didn't get the full double wall treatment because they faced the winter sun and less severe weather. But Jonas chinked these walls much more carefully than his first cabin. He used a specific recipe he'd developed. The base layer was small split wood pieces wedged tightly into the gaps. Over this went a mixture of clay, sand, and cow hair. He'd traded for a bag of hair trimmings from a settler's ranch down valley. The hair reinforced the clay, preventing cracks. The sand added structure. The clay provided the seal. Jonas added one more element to his chinking recipe: lime. He'd learned from another trapper that mixing a small amount of lime into clay chinking made it more resistant to water damage and cracking. The lime created a mild chemical reaction that hardened the mixture and made it more durable. Jonas didn't understand the chemistry, but he understood results. The new cabin structure had begun taking shape. Jonas stood by his freshly installed stove, testing a new fire-starting method he'd been developing. Most trappers built fires the traditional way: crumpled bark or dry grass at the bottom, small kindling stacked on top, larger pieces above that. You'd light the bottom and hope the fire caught upward through the stack. The problem with this method was inefficiency. Bottom-up fires created turbulent airflow. Smoke filled the cabin before the draft established itself properly. The fire required constant attention in the first 15 to 20 minutes. And if you didn't get the kindling arrangement exactly right, the whole thing could fail. You'd waste multiple matches trying to get it started. Jonas had observed something during his first winter. When fires burned cleanly, they pulled air from below and exhausted heat and smoke upward. The draft created a natural chimney effect. But bottom-up fires fought this natural flow until they built sufficient heat. What if you started the fire at the top instead? The concept seemed counterintuitive. Fire rises. Everyone knew that. But Jonas reasoned that if you could establish a clean draft from the beginning, the fire would burn more efficiently throughout its entire life cycle. He developed a method. First, he split his firewood into precisely sized pieces. Large splits at the bottom of the stack, medium pieces in the middle layer, small kindling toward the top. The arrangement created channels for air to flow upward through the entire stack. At the very top, he placed his starter material, but not crumpled bark. He'd created something better. A thin wooden stick about the diameter of his thumb, drilled with evenly spaced holes along its length. He'd coat this stick with pine resin he'd boiled down from sap. The resin made it incredibly flammable. The holes allowed air to flow through it, feeding the initial flame. He positioned this starter stick across the top of his wood stack, horizontal. The holes faced the airflow direction, one match to the resin-coated wood. The stick ignited immediately. Clean flame, no smoke. The fire burned downward through the kindling layer, establishing draft as it went. Within 2 minutes, the entire stack was burning with a steady, controlled flame. No smoke in the cabin, no multiple match attempts, no constant adjustment. The method worked because it cooperated with natural airflow patterns instead of fighting them. The fire started hot and clean, pulling air efficiently from the beginning. As it burned downward, it preheated the wood below. By the time flames reached the larger splits, those pieces were already warm and dry, ready to burn efficiently. Jonas tested the method repeatedly over the next week. Each time, one match. Each time, clean start. Each time, the fire required minimal attention once established. The time savings were substantial. Traditional fire starting took 15 to 20 minutes of active work, multiple match attempts, constant adjustment, smoke management. His method took 2 minutes, one match. Then he could leave it alone. That was 13 to 18 minutes saved every time he lit a fire. He lit his stove twice a day, minimum, often 3 times. Over the course of a winter day, this saved between 26 and 54 minutes. Call it an average of 40 minutes. Round down to be conservative, 35 minutes per day. Over a 6-month winter season, roughly 180 days, that was 6,300 minutes saved. 105 hours. The equivalent of 4 full days and nights of work time returned to him simply by changing how he started his fires. An hour a day. That time could now be used for projects like building a porch, a luxury he never could have afforded in the past winter. The valley was blanketed in snow. Temperatures had reached 30 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Jonas tested his new design with a fire that ran for hours without constant attention. The third major change to his cabin design involved the fireplace and thermal mass. Instead of building against the outer wall, Jonas positioned his fireplace in the interior, about 4 feet from the north wall. He built the firebox and hearth from carefully selected stones, flat ones for the firebox floor, rounded river stones for the upper structure. But the key feature was the mass. Jonas built the fireplace structure much larger than strictly necessary for the firebox itself. The stone chimney was thick and wide, creating significant thermal mass inside the cabin. He extended stone benches out from each side of the fireplace. These created places to sit that also served as additional heat-storing mass. The entire structure probably weighed 4 or 5 tons of stone, all positioned in the interior of the cabin, where its stored heat would radiate into the living space. The design principle was straightforward. Fire a hot blaze for an hour or two, heating all that stone. The stone absorbed the heat, then slowly released it over the next 8 to 10 hours. This meant Jonas could let the fire die down to coals or even go out completely. The cabin would stay warm from the radiant heat of the stone mass. He'd effectively built a battery for warmth, charging it up periodically rather than maintaining a constant fire. During the January cold snap, Jonas ran his fireplace routine each day. Hot fire for a few hours each afternoon and evening. Then let it die down overnight. The massive stone structure held warmth through the night. The double walls prevented cold from penetrating from the north and west. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. And the raised floor kept ground cold from seeping up. Jonas kept careful records in his ledger. Firewood consumption, less than half what he'd used the previous winter. The cabin stayed dramatically more comfortable. He could work on projects inside without gloves. He could sleep without piling on every blanket he owned. The difference was remarkable enough that other trappers who visited immediately wanted to know what he'd done differently. The stone mass stored heat during the day, released it through the night. The cabin maintained relatively stable temperature despite exterior extremes. Jonas burned 1.5 cords per month. Compare that to 4 cords from the previous year. He'd cut his fuel consumption by more than 60%. That translated to direct time savings beyond the fire-starting method. Less wood to cut, less wood to haul, less wood to split. Fewer trips to the woodpile during storms. Add it all up, and Jonas was saving roughly an hour and a half per day compared to his first winter. 45 minutes from efficient fire starting and fuel consumption. Another 45 minutes from reduced wood processing needs. That time went directly into improving his homestead. He could now afford to build things that had seemed impossible before. Jonas sat back, surveying the newly finished porch, a project he never would have been able to complete if not for the hour per day saved by his new heating system. The porch measured 8 feet wide by 12 feet deep. It wrapped around the south and east sides of the cabin. He'd built it using carefully selected logs for the support posts, split puncheons for the floor, hand-planed boards for the railings. The construction required precise work. Each post had to be set at exactly the right height. Each floorboard had to be fitted tightly to prevent gaps. The railings needed to be sturdy enough to lean against safely. In past winters, this work would have been impossible. Jonas would have spent all his time just keeping warm, cutting firewood, hauling it, splitting it, feeding the fire. The cycle consumed entire days. But now, with his efficient stove and fire-starting method, He had time, real time, time that could be directed toward improvement rather than mere survival. He'd started the porch in mid-January, working during the warmer hours of each day when sunlight provided additional heat. The double-wall cabin stayed, warm enough that he could return inside during the coldest parts of the day without needing to immediately restart a major fire. The work took 6 weeks, but it was focused, productive work, not the desperate, exhausted labor of the previous winter. The porch served multiple functions. It provided a covered area for storing tools and supplies. It created a buffer space between the interior and exterior. Opening the door in winter no longer meant losing all the cabin's accumulated warmth. The porch acted as an airlock, and it gave Jonas a place to sit during fair weather, a luxury that seemed trivial until you had it. The time accounting was precise. Traditional fire starting, 20 minutes per fire, 3 fires per day, 60 minutes total. His method, 2 minutes per fire, 6 minutes total, 54 minutes saved daily. Traditional firewood consumption, 4 cords per month. Time to cut, haul, split, approximately 8 hours per cord, 32 hours per month. His consumption, 1.5 cords per month. Time required, 12 hours per month, 20 hours saved monthly. Combined daily and monthly savings, over 6 winter months, roughly 300 hours returned. That was 12.5 full days. Nearly 2 weeks of continuous work time extracted from improved efficiency. Jonas used 140 of those hours building his porch. The remainder went into other improvements. Better door hinges, window shutters, storage shelves, maintenance tasks that would have been impossible to complete while fighting just to stay warm. The porch wasn't decoration. It was proof of concept. Time saved equaled life improved. Small efficiencies compounded into major advantages. As snow melted, Jonas's cabin remained a beacon of practicality. Other trappers and settlers passing through took note of the improvements. Some asked how his fire burned so efficiently. Others marveled at the warmth inside the cabin even when the fire had died to embers. Word spread through the scattered trapping community during the winter of 1836 to 37. Trappers traveling through the area stopped to see Jonas's setup. Some continued to think the effort excessive, but others began asking questions. How did he attach the logs? Where did he get materials for the double walls? What was in the chinking mixture? How did the fire-starting method work exactly? Jonas shared his techniques freely. He wasn't trying to keep secrets. He was trying to stay alive. And if others could benefit from what he'd learned, that was acceptable. He explained the double wall principle, 2 layers of logs with trapped air between them. The air itself provided insulation as long as it couldn't circulate. He demonstrated his chinking recipe: clay, sand, cow hair, and a small amount of lime. The mixture remained flexible through temperature changes, but didn't crack like traditional clay. He showed them his fire-starting method: the perforated starter stick coated with pine resin, the top-down stacking that created clean draft from the first moment. 1 match, 2 minutes, ready to leave alone. Some trappers adopted the entire system. Others took pieces. The fire-starting method spread fastest because it required minimal investment. Anyone could make a starter stick. Anyone could coat it with resin. Anyone could stack wood top-down instead of bottom-up. The time savings were immediately apparent. Trappers who tried the method once rarely went back to traditional fire starting. Why waste 15 minutes and multiple matches when you could accomplish the same result in 2 minutes with 1 match? The double wall construction spread more slowly. It required significant additional work during building. But trappers who faced serious cold, or those who had lost cabins to inadequate insulation, began incorporating the technique. A French-Canadian trapper named Remy built a hybrid structure: double walls only on the north side, saving work while still getting significant insulation benefits. By 1838, several cabins in the valley featured variations on Jonas's design. The specific combination of techniques varied based on each person's needs, available materials, and building skills. But the underlying principles remain the same. Build for the worst conditions you can imagine. Take time to do it right. Use materials efficiently. Engineer the space to work with natural heat flows rather than fighting them. The methods were now adopted across the Wind River Valley. Jonas Fletcher's innovations were becoming standard practice. A brutal winter storm locked the valley in snow. Temperatures dropped to 30 degrees Fahrenheit below zero. Wind screamed across the prairie at 40 miles per hour. 3 feet of snow fell in a single day. Jonas's cabin stood firm. The new design held strong as temperatures plummeted. He maintained his routine: hot fire for 2 hours in the afternoon. The stone mass absorbed heat. He let the fire die down to coals by evening. The cabin stayed warm through the night. The double walls prevented cold penetration. The tight chinking eliminated drafts. The raised floor kept ground cold from conducting upward. And the central fireplace, with its massive thermal mass, continued radiating heat for 8 to 10 hours after the fire died. Jonas's firewood consumption remained consistent with previous months: 1.5 cords. He checked his supply regularly. He had enough wood stacked to last through March without difficulty. Other cabins in the valley struggled. William Crawford, whose claim adjoined Jonas's to the south, burned through his entire winter wood supply by mid-January. He spent the next 6 weeks in desperate daily trips to cut more. Each trip in 30 below temperatures was dangerous, exhausting. Crawford's wife developed pneumonia from the constant cold in their inadequately insulated cabin. The contrast became stark. Jonas could work inside comfortably. Crawford fought just to survive. Jonas had time for maintenance and improvements. Crawford had time for nothing but wood cutting and fire feeding. The storm that hit on January 15th was the worst of the season. It lasted 3 days. Visibility dropped to 0. Wind created drifts 15 feet deep in places. Several settlers who'd been checking animals when the storm hit didn't make it back to their cabins. Jonas stayed inside his cabin for the entire 72 hours. He maintained comfortable temperature with minimal fuel. His one-match fire-starting method meant he never wasted matches or time during the crisis. Light the starter stick. 2 minutes later, solid fire. Return to other tasks. When the storm finally cleared, Jonas's cabin showed no damage. The structure remained solid. The carefully chinked walls had held. The double-layer roof had shed snow without sagging. Jonas's method had passed its most severe test. The cabin stayed warm. Fuel consumption stayed manageable. And he'd survived the worst winter conditions the valley had seen in decades. The hours saved daily had accumulated into something more valuable than time. It had become margin for survival. The valley remained buried under snow and ice. Another storm system moved through in mid-February. This one brought not just cold and snow, but sustained wind that made travel dangerous even for short distances. William Crawford's situation had become critical. His wife's pneumonia had worsened. They'd run out of firewood again. Crawford needed to cut more. But leaving his wife alone in the cold cabin while he worked seemed impossible. She couldn't maintain the fire herself. Crawford made the decision to bring her to Jonas's cabin. He loaded her onto a sled and pulled her through waist-deep snow. The journey of less than a mile took nearly 2 hours. When he reached Jonas's door, Crawford was near exhaustion, his wife barely conscious from cold and illness. Jonas opened the door immediately. Warm air poured out. Not just bearable warmth, genuine heat. The kind that had been missing from the Crawford cabin for weeks. Mrs. Crawford was placed in Jonas's bed, piled with blankets. The stone fireplace radiated steady warmth, even though the fire had burned down to coals hours earlier. Jonas built up the fire again, using his one-match method. Within minutes, the cabin was warm enough that Mrs. Crawford stopped shivering. They stayed 3 days. By the time they left, her pneumonia had stabilized. The consistent warmth had allowed her body to fight the infection. Crawford tried to thank Jonas, but words weren't adequate. Before leaving, Crawford asked a simple question. "How much firewood do you have left?" Jonas walked him to the storage area, showed him the remaining supply. At least 6 cords, more than enough to last through March and into April if needed. Crawford's face showed the calculation. Jonas had started winter with 10 cords. He'd burned 4 cords over 4 months. Crawford had started with 8 cords. He'd burned all 8 cords in 2 months, and still hadn't stayed warm. The difference wasn't minor. It was the difference between having margin and having none, between comfort and desperation, between health and illness. Crawford returned to his cabin, but he made a decision. He wasn't going to rebuild there next year. He would study Jonas's methods. He would build properly. He would engineer his space for survival, not just adequate shelter. The final test had proven more than just cabin design. It had proven that methodical preparation outperformed desperate improvisation every time. The storms subsided. Sun broke through clouds. As Jonas surveyed the aftermath, he realized the efficient fuel consumption had allowed him to finish critical projects. The porch stood complete. Storage sheds were built, window shutters were installed, and functional. Jonas had entered winter with 10 cords of firewood. He ended winter with 3 cords remaining. That represented a 40% surplus. Insurance against unexpected late storms. Margin that most trappers didn't have. The porch had been finished in late February during a warm spell between storms. The final railing piece went up on March 1st. Jonas stood back and looked at what he'd built. Not just a cabin, not just a porch, but a homestead that worked. The hours saved per day had compounded. 30 minutes from efficient fire starting, 30 minutes from reduced fuel consumption, 60 minutes total. Over 6 months, that was 180 hours, 7.5 full days returned. Jonas had used that time to build infrastructure, the porch, the sheds, the shutters, all improvements that would serve him for years. But more importantly, he'd used that time to avoid desperation. He hadn't spent winter in survival mode. He'd spent it in improvement mode. The contrast with other settlers was stark. Crawford had survived, but gained nothing. His cabin remained inadequate. His wood supply exhausted. His wife's health damaged. He would start next year from 0. Jonas would start next year from surplus. His cabin was proven, his methods tested, his fuel reserves intact. He could focus on expansion rather than basic survival. The one-match stove start method had not just saved fuel, it had saved time, and time, properly used, had built the visible proof standing before him. The porch was more than construction. It was accumulated margin made physical. Other trappers who visited that spring saw the porch and asked about it. Jonas explained the time accounting, show them his starter stick, demonstrate the top-down fire method, explain the thermal mass fireplace design. Some understood immediately. Others remained skeptical. But the porch stood as undeniable evidence. You could argue about methods. You couldn't argue about results. Jonas Fletcher had entered the worst winter in Valley history. He'd exited it with improved infrastructure and surplus supplies. That was the turning point. From survival to sustainable homesteading. From adequate to optimized. As Jonas shared knowledge with passing trappers, his innovations spread through the region. The one-match fire-starting technique became a staple method. The instructions were simple enough to remember, the materials easy enough to gather, the results immediate enough to convince skeptics. By summer, trappers throughout the northern Rockies were using variations of the method. Some made starter sticks from pine, others used cedar. Some coated them with pine resin. Others used animal fat mixed with charcoal. The specific materials varied. The principle remained constant. Top-down fire, clean draft, one match. The double-wall construction spread more selectively. It required significant additional work during building. But in the coldest regions, high-altitude valleys, northern exposures, areas with severe wind, the technique became standard. Trappers who'd lost cabins to inadequate insulation during the hard winter rebuilt using Jonas's methods. A settlement pattern emerged. New cabins built after 1837 showed noticeably different construction. Raised foundations became common. Double-wall sections on north-facing walls. Central or near-central fireplace placement. Thermal mass integrated into living space rather than exterior walls. The knowledge moved organically, trapper to trapper, settler to settler. No formal documentation, no published manuals, just people sharing what worked, explaining principles, demonstrating techniques. Jonas himself became sought after for advice. Settlers would visit his claim, examine his cabin, ask questions about every detail. He answered patiently. He never charged for the information. He never claimed exclusive credit. He simply explained what he'd learned from Niels Bergstrom, Morning Crow, and his own observations. The spread of Jonas's methods marked a shift towards smarter frontier living, not faster building, not cheaper construction, but engineered solutions that prioritized long-term survival over short-term convenience. By 1840, an estimated 40 to 50 cabins across the Rocky Mountain territories incorporated elements of Jonas's design. Some used the complete system, others adapted pieces. But the underlying philosophy had taken root. Build for the worst conditions, engineer for efficiency, take time to do it right. The time savings compounded across multiple households. If 50 cabins each saved 1 hour per day, that was 50 hours daily. Over a 6-month winter, that was 9,000 hours. 375 full days of work time returned to the frontier community through better engineering. That time translated into better infrastructure, improved health outcomes, reduced mortality from exposure, and cold-related illness. The impact couldn't be calculated precisely, but it was real. Jonas Fletcher's cabin stood firm into 1838 and beyond. The structure would last over 40 years, not because it was lucky, because it was built right. Jonas himself stayed in the Wind River Valley until 1843. The fur trade was dying, beaver populations trapped out, silk replacing beaver felt in hat production. But Jonas had come to love the mountains and the valley where he'd learned his hard lessons. He eventually married a Shoshone woman, Morning Crow's cousin. They raised 3 children in that carefully built cabin. Jonas made his living guiding settlers through mountain passes, using knowledge gained during his trapping years. The cabin served his family well. Winters were manageable. Fuel consumption remained low. The double walls continued insulating. The thermal mass fireplace continued storing and releasing heat. The structure required minimal maintenance beyond routine chinking repair and roof upkeep. When Jonas finally left the valley in the 1860s, moving closer to a grown child, the cabin was still solid. Logs intact, chinking holding firm, stone fireplace as sound as the day he'd built it. Other settlers used it for years afterward, recognizing the quality of construction. The building techniques Jonas developed and shared weren't revolutionary in the sense of being entirely new. Double-wall construction existed in Scandinavian tradition. Thermal mass use existed in indigenous building methods. Top-down fire starting had been practiced in various forms. What Jonas did was combine them specifically for Rocky Mountain conditions. He adapted knowledge from multiple sources: Norwegian log building, Shoshone thermal management, his own carpentry background, and he shared the results freely. The real innovation was recognizing that a cabin could be engineered to work with natural heat flows, to store and release warmth strategically, to minimize fuel consumption while maximizing comfort. This required understanding basic principles of heat transfer, even if Jonas never knew formal engineering terms. Modern visitors to the Wind River Valley can still find the site of Jonas's cabin. The structure itself is long gone, but the original hearthstone remains. A massive slab of river stone that once sat at the center of his thermal mass fireplace. It marks the location where one trapper learned to build right instead of building fast. A historical marker stands nearby. Installed in 1972, it reads, Site of Jonas Fletcher Cabin, 1835 to 1863. Pioneer of efficient frontier construction techniques. The marker mentions nothing about the one-match stove start, nothing about double walls or thermal mass, just efficient construction techniques. But that phrase carries the legacy. Jonas Fletcher's methods had not just survived the worst winters, they had become part of how people lived on the frontier. His approach, careful observation, methodical adaptation, and sharing of knowledge, influenced settlers and trappers for generations. The cabin's foundation stones still rest where Jonas placed them, raised 2 feet above ground, creating the thermal buffer that kept his family warm through 40 Rocky Mountain winters. That buffer remains, silent testimony to what knowledge and discipline could accomplish. One man's refusal to accept that adequate was enough. 1 hour saved per day accumulated into a lifetime of improved survival. The hearthstone sits at the original site, weathered by 185 years of mountain weather, but still intact, still marking where warmth was stored and lives were saved. Jonas Fletcher's innovations, his methodical, evidence-based approach to cabin building and fire management, changed how people survived in the Rocky Mountains. The one-match stove start was not a simple trick. It was a systematic approach to fuel efficiency that returned time, conserved resources, and created margin in an environment where margin meant survival. The result, smarter use of materials, deeper respect for engineering principles, and a model of sustainable frontier living that echoed through generations, not through written manuals or formal instruction, but through demonstrated results. A cabin that stayed warm, a porch built with surplus time, a family that thrived where others merely survived. The lesson persists. Small efficiencies compound into major advantages. Time saved accumulates into infrastructure built. Preparation outperforms desperation. And knowledge freely shared multiplies its value across entire communities. What choice would you have made on that day? Share your thoughts in the comments. Practical stories keep this history alive.